Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. On today's Podcast for Inquiry, I speak with Paris Marx, a critic of Silicon Valley business practices and the impact they have on workers and society at large. Paris writes the Disconnect newsletter and hosts Tech Won't Save Us, an award-winning critical technology podcast. In today's episode, Paris explains the flaws in each category of the tech sector, including blockchain and cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, Dogecoin, Tether, and so on. Various asset-light service firms, such as Uber, Lyft, and AirBnB. Amazon, because it's in a category all on its own. And various digital-only technology platforms, such as Google, Facebook, Instagram, TwitterX, and more. Without further ado, I bring you my conversation with Paris Marx. It's a pleasure to have you on Podcast for Inquiry today.
It's great to speak with you. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Now, I learned about you earlier this year through your podcast, Tech Won't Save Us. And the way it was described to me wasn't terribly accurate, but it gave me a fairly negative impression before I actually listened to it. And because the way it was described to me is that you're just down on technology companies and technology in general. And as someone personally who's very pro-science and on balance, and I think that's an important caveat, on balance thinks that technology has been a boon to humanity overall, I wasn't sure that I was going to enjoy your podcast. But what I found when I actually listened to it is an informed critique of aspects of the technology industry, or what we call tech, whether it is or not, that was thoughtful and informed, and it introduced me to a lot of ideas that were new to me, and has caused me to ponder and reflect in a way that in some ways was uncomfortable, but also incredibly valuable. And that process is what this podcast is supposed to be about. So I'm very glad to bring you onto the podcast to introduce these ideas to our audience.
It's really great to hear that, just because, when I started the show, part of the motivation was to be able to provide a bit of a different perspective than people probably often hear when they listen to podcasts about technology or read news about technology and things like that, right? We're used to kind of a very uncritical and I would say almost boosterish kind of perspective on technology that we get through a lot of kind of tech media. And of course, that has changed a bit in the past few years, where we do have more critical reporting and more kind of criticism than there used to be. But I thought that there was a real kind of opening for space for critical conversations with experts on various different, forms of technologies or aspects of the tech industry or people in the tech industry, to actually discuss kind of the motivations of those people and those companies and the potential ways that, the goal isn't to be completely anti-technology, but to say, okay, how are these technologies being deployed? What is the goal behind this? And is this actually serving the public in the way that a lot of the people in the industry would suggest? Or are there reasons for us to, be skeptical of and even to oppose the way that certain technologies are being deployed in society? Not because we're anti-technology, but because the specific way that this technology is being used is not in the interest of.
Yeah, another person who has shaped a lot of my thoughts on the technology industry is Cory Doctorow, and something that he has written many times in various of his essays is that it's not just about technology itself, what the capability, but if we're going to evaluate it, we need to know, we need to understand who the technology is working for, and who the technology and what the technology is doing it to. And that sometimes can take something that has the potential to be good and maybe a reevaluation that even if it could be good, is it actually being used for purposes that are beneficial to society overall? You've got dozens, hundreds of episodes of your podcast, and we can dive really, really deep into any one of these issues. But what I would like to do is just talk very broadly. And what I've done is I've thought about sort of different classifications of what we broadly call the tech industry. And I'd like to get your thoughts on why certain things that have been promoted, or some people actually think of as being great, might warrant a second thought. So the first category of tech companies that I'd like to talk about is the blockchain and cryptocurrencies. So Bitcoin was the first one of those. It's probably the best known, but there's many others: Ethereum, Dogecoin, Tether, and so on. And if you want, we can also get into a little bit on the fad that flamed very high and then flamed very out of what's called NFTs. So can you tell us a little bit about what digital currencies are, what the blockchain is, what the boosters say is great about it, and why a sober second thought might be warranted?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like, these technologies have been around for quite a long time, right? Like Bitcoin was launched, I believe something like 14 or 15 years ago. I remember in 2014 being in Eastern Europe and seeing like Bitcoin ATMs, before it was in much of kind of the public consciousness. These things have been slowly kind of gaining steam over time. And then during the pandemic, what we saw is they really had a moment where there was a suggestion that they were kind of going to form the future of the web, the future of the financial system. We were all going to be using these cryptocurrencies and, would be having our transactions recorded on the blockchain, and potentially other interactions that we do as well, depending on how it was going to be rolled out through the web.
So how does the blockchain and cryptocurrencies differ from, in Canada we have what's called an e-transfer, or just more broadly, standard banking, but done over the web, done digitally. What's the difference between me writing you a digital check or electronically transferring money from my bank account to yours, and using a cryptocurrency or a blockchain based technology to transfer money from me to you?
Yeah, it is quite different. And I would just say that I think part of it is also motivated by kind of flaws in the American banking system and how they seem to be quite behind on adopting newer banking technologies. Like I'm sure Canadians who visit the United States frequently can remember going down there and they still didn't have chip cards like years after we did. And even if they had the machines in like the various Walgreens or CVS or whatever, they might not even know how they worked. Because they were still using kind of swipe in their credit card technologies, right? And so, as far as I understand, the ability to easily transfer money between banks is not, as common as it is here in Canada, where we have the Interact e-transfer system that works very kind of seamlessly and is quite easy to use. And so, if you go into your bank now and you look to transfer money to somebody, it's a very easy process. You put in their email address or their phone number, depending on which bank that you use, and you can easily send money that way. And those are kind of, the different banks basically have centralized databases of all of the financial information for the various customers that they have. And then that information is kind of transferred between the different banks because they have, means of exchanging that information, I guess. And then if you look on kind of more of an international system, some of those transfers can take a little bit extra time just because of kind of checks and balances that exist in the system to make sure that money laundering and things like that are not going on. So that's often why there's a bit of a delay with international money transfers if people have done things like that and you haven't used PayPal or whatnot to do it. So blockchain and the cryptocurrencies promise a very different way of doing these things, right? They say that instead of the bank bank having control over, all of this money and all of this infrastructure. Instead, it's going to be decentralized on all of our computers, and our computers will be kind of, running processes in order to to transact and to allow these transactions to happen. And that means that centralized authorities like banks are not going to have control over the money that we use and kind of the means of sending it back and forth. In reality, though, that is not entirely true. Even though that there are often claims of decentralization among these communities, and that is what some people claim to be really interested in when it comes to these things, what we see in reality is that it is highly centralized around a small number of key exchanges and kind of blockchain and cryptocurrency services, and that even the miners, which are kind of the people who control the computing technology that verifies these transactions, essentially, a lot of that computing power is actually owned by a small number of really large kind of players in the ecosystem.
So why is decentralization desirable? Like you just said, why does that matter?
Yeah, the idea is that because it's centralized right now, then the power is in the hands of these particular actors, right? The government, the Bank of Canada, major banks, and that if we decentralize it, then all of a sudden the power is also decentralized along with it. And so all of that power is in our hands as individual kind of users of financial products instead of in these centralized institutions. But as I said, that's not entirely accurate, right? The real kind of what would really happen if this was integrated through the system is that we'd have not so much getting rid of centralized power, but a shifting of power from one kind of nexus or one place, these traditional institutions that we're used to managing the financial system right now, Bank of Canada, the big banks, whatever, to these newer institutions controlled by, newer capital from the tech industry, these crypto exchanges, these blockchain companies and things like that would ultimately be quite centralized as well.
And do we actually, so when we talk about the government, I know who the government is. We've got our federal government, we've got provincial, in other countries might be a state, we've got municipal government, we've got elected leaders, we've got the civil service working behind them in the bureaucracy. When we're talking about the major financial institutions, we can identify who they are. In Canada, we've got the big five and a couple of other smaller ones. In the States, again, you know who the financial institutions are. They are identifiable, and with that comes some accountability, at least in principle. You've mentioned that there are new institutions, new power blocks on the cryptocurrencies, but do we know who they are, or is it just a shift of transfer, a transfer of power from one entity that's known, even if we don't like it, or maybe we do, to another that is unknown, and if we don't like what this new institution is doing, is there any recourse?
Not really. Like there is a degree of transparency, and that's one thing that kind of advocates of cryptocurrencies would say is that actually, since all these things are recorded on the blockchain and we can all see what's on the blockchain, then we can know everything, right? But the reality is that anyone can kind of set up an account to transfer cryptocurrencies to, and your identity does not have to be easily linked to that account. So even though things are transacting, it doesn't mean that we know exactly who is associated with the specific kind of number or key or whatever that is making those transactions. When we look at the larger companies, some of them are very open, right? They're public companies. People might be familiar with Sam Bankman-Fried, of course, who used to control FTX before, now he's, of course, being charged in US court. But, he was very open. So we knew who was controlling that specific company. But there are other companies that are very influential, like Tether, for example, where the actual ownership structures and who is in control is much more shady and much less clear, even though they are very central to this entire ecosystem. And so these people claim that what they're doing is, kind of fixing the financial system and kind of ensuring that power is being distributed to, all of us instead of to these legacy institutions. But really, they are trying to grab power and wealth for themselves. And if we really wanted to address the problems, because this is one of the most important things with this, right, is there are real problems and real inequities in the financial system with how our banking system works, with who can have access to banking services. We know that that is a serious problem. problem. But that's not just going to be fixed through a technological solution deployed by, kind of tech libertarians and people who just think technology is going to solve everything. That requires kind of public policy, right?
Perfect. So that leads me to my next question. Which is what? Okay, so my question is, what is the appeal? Why would someone want to use a cryptocurrency if you can just do the same sorts of things like transfer money or like have a bank account or have a certain number of tokens or coins in a particular currency? I guess one possibility is that if I'm an if I'm an outspoken activist for the non-religious in a theocracy, then being able to conduct financial transactions secretly will protect me, and it will protect me from having my bank accounts seized. However, if I happen to be a billionaire or just a very wealthy person and I want to launder my money, I would use this. It would be appealing for the same reason that the authorities wouldn't be able to track me down. So whether you're a tyrannical oppressor or a freedom fighter, the same technology can be used. So aside from at least the possibility of anonymity or of not being subject to repression from the institutions, from the powers that be. Okay, let's acknowledge that. Is there any other appeal to cryptocurrencies aside from just duplicating what already exists within the existing financial markets?
I would say it's very narrow, and because those uses are so narrow, you wonder how useful the system would actually be, right? Like Bitcoin and these cryptocurrencies are traditionally associated with kind of black market activities, buying porn, buying weapons, buying drugs, things like that through illicit marketplaces on the dark
avoiding
web.
capital controls, money laundering.
Yep. One of the bigger stories that a lot of people kind of grabbed onto during this kind of crypto hype moment was how the North Korean government hacked a lot of, people's Bitcoin and cryptocurrency accounts and have been, partially funding some of their operations by basically stealing and laundering cryptocurrencies and getting kind of capital through that, right? But the actual kind of real use cases for average everyday use are very limited because the infrastructure that's required to run these cryptocurrencies is very energy intensive, very resource intensive. And the people who have done research on this find that it's far less efficient than the banking networks, with debit cards and credit cards, the Visa network, things like that we have right now. They can process many more transactions much faster and much more efficiently than the cryptocurrency networks that, were being suggested as a replacement for them. And some people who are advocates for this would say that actually it's very useful for people in the global south, right? To be able to send remittances and not have to pay bank payments, or to be able to kind of put their currencies where they might have really high inflation into these cryptocurrencies instead of holding them in, say, the Turkish lira or the Argentinian currency or whatever, right?
Both of those sound great.
Right. But my response there would be like, yes, that is true. But why are those problems happening in the first place? Right. And the reason that those things are happening is, again, because of political decisions that have created a really inequitable global financial system, right? We can look at the domestic problems, the fact that we have this banking system that leads to inequities within our own country, where we have these high fees from the banks and all this kind of stuff that we know are a real problem. But then we look internationally and we say, okay, why is Canada quite rich as a country? And why are countries like Argentina experiencing massive inflation? And all these countries through the global south are really suffering in this moment when the US dollar is increasing in value. That's because of how we have created the global financial system to put the United States in particular at the center of it, right? And the US dollar. And so actually kind of improving that kind of structural nature of things is not going to happen because of cryptocurrencies. That requires much deeper kind of discussions on the UN level or something to actually try to address these fundamental inequities.
There's a lot more that we can get into, but I want that. Thank you for giving us a lot to think about on cryptocurrencies. I want to move to a different section of what we consider to be tech companies. And I don't know if it has, I'm doing this classification myself. I don't know if there's a formal name for it, but they're what I call asset light companies. So what I'm thinking of are companies like Airbnb, which is sort of like a hotel, but it owns no real estate. Something like Lyft and Uber, which is public transit or a taxi service, but it owns no vehicle. So it doesn't have the assets that would normally be required it doesn't own the assets that are actually providing the service. And I remember when Airbnb and Uber and then later Lyft were fairly new. You compare Airbnb price to a hotel price, and hey, it was cheaper, and that great. And if I know how much a cab costs, and I could hail one, I guess, and I could pay for that, or I could take an Uber or Lyft and pay. At first it was half, but then a third or a quarter less than I would for a cab company. It's like, well, I'm certainly benefiting. Why I can understand why people like this, and these are companies that you haven't said very nice things about, and I would like. What's wrong with these? What's wrong with a company providing a service that people want at a lower price than the traditional players? Isn't that what competition is for? Isn't that a good thing?
Theoretically, I would say, like, oh my God, there's so much I could say about this. I've written immensely about it, right?
Yes, but I want you to choose what to say.
Yeah, exactly. So I would say that part of the problem there is that they never actually provided the service more cheaply than what was available before, right? What they did was they massively subsidized the delivery of their service by losing billions of dollars a year for many years. Uber just reported recently that it has finally delivered an operating profit for the first time ever. It was started in 2008, and it has lost more than $30 billion since 2014 because it has never actually made money. And the reason that the Uber fare looked so much cheaper than the taxi fare was because it was losing all that money and not actually turning a profit. Whereas your little individual taxi companies in different cities can't go ahead and just lose money indefinitely because, they need to keep the lights on. They need to pay the bills. But a company like Uber was subsidized by these venture capitalists to try to run the taxi services out of business, to try to, hurt and damage our public transit systems so that more people would have to take Uber, so that they would eventually have a monopoly or a quasi-monopoly, so that they would have much more control over raising prices and things like that. And then the other piece of the Uber model that I think is really important is that it's also, kind of fights to ensure that it's not under traditional regulations. So taxi regulations would not apply to Uber. That means it wouldn't pay the same taxes as a taxi company would. It means it doesn't need to provide the same services to people with disabilities, people in wheelchairs and things like that. Uber has consistently fought being recognized under the Americans with Disabilities Act by saying that it's a tech company and not a transportation company. And then the other piece of that is, of course, changing the terms of work for the drivers who deliver the service. So union taxi drivers, some of them were union, but even the ones that weren't had protections under the taxi regulations that existed to ensure that they made a decent wage. By blowing that up, Uber ensured that they were no longer employees, that they had very little were not able to depend on the income that they were making from this. Even though, their marketing would say otherwise. And so what we had was a service that did not abide by regulations, that had a lot of kind of negative externalities, that looked cheaper to the consumer because it lost so much money, but also because it ensured it was paying drivers less than a taxi would. And that, allowed it to kind of reduce the cost of service delivery as well. Yeah.
So in other words, they lost a whole bunch of money, so you can offer your service cheaply or for free, even if you're willing to lose money on every transaction. That's pretty easy, which they did. And then they practiced. You didn't use the phrase, but it sounds like they were engaging in regulatory arbitrage. It's like, we may be transporting a person from place A to place B, but we're not a taxi company, so none of the rules apply to us. They got to make up their own rules. So the restrictions that existed, for good or for ill, on the taxi industry, Uber just said doesn't apply to us, and they just ignored it.
For the most part, yeah, especially in the United States, and even in Canada as well. Like now, a lot of cities do have some degree of regulation on the ride-hailing services, as I would call them. You know, the Ubers and Lyfts of the world, but they are not as stringent as the regulations that were once on the taxi industry.
Why
And
not?
I so
Like
I
that
think
strikes. That's. I mean, okay. I've got a couple questions, but like, let's focus on that. If you're moving a person from place A to place B, I mean, that's fine, and I don't think that taxis should be protected, that no one else should be able to do that necessarily, at least in principle. But if you're going to do that, why don't they operate under the same regime, under the same rules? I mean, we talk a lot in the public discourse about a level playing field. Why isn't there a level playing field between Uber, Lyft, and public transit and taxi companies?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And before I answer the specific question, let me just say why those taxi regulations were in place in the first place, right?
Sure.
Because taxis did emerge at a time, or at one point in time, and what happened was they found that the people driving the taxis couldn't make enough money. There were too many vehicles on the street, so that was creating traffic congestion, right? And so taxi regulations were brought in to ensure that there was a balance between what was good for the drivers and what was good for the public. So you ensured that the number of taxis was regulated so that you weren't having too many vehicles on the street and that was creating too much traffic, but also so that the drivers, driving those vehicles could make a decent living at the end of the day. And that was a trade-off that we accepted, but that did mean that sometimes you would have to wait a little bit longer in order to get a taxi. And that was something that, over time people got a bit more angry about. And maybe we could say that maybe the caps on the taxi numbers should have increased or whatever. So Uber and Lyft came along and they basically said, this taxi model isn't working because the old taxi companies control everything. So what we need to do is we need to blow that up and create something different. So because it wasn't under those regulations, it didn't have to provide the drivers a certain standard of living. The taxi fares were actually regulated so that they would charge a certain amount, and that meant the drivers would be paid a certain amount. And it also ensured that there was no limit on the number of vehicles that could be on the road at any time under the Uber model. And that meant that there's been plenty of studies now showing that Uber increases traffic congestion in cities because it does flood the streets with so many additional vehicles. And so part of the reason Uber is not covered by those same taxi regulations is that, remember, in the aftermath of the 2008 recession, the tech industry was really positioned as one of the key industries that was going to drive economic growth and job creation into this kind of next wave of the economy, right? A lot of people lost their jobs. There was a lot of kind of difficulty. And a lot of these tech companies took advantage of that to roll out and say, we are not this traditional service. We are something new. And there was all of this goodwill given to the tech industry and the tech companies in that time. And they were able to kind of use that to say, we shouldn't be covered by these regulations because that's going to stop us from creating prosperity and creating jobs. But if you allow us to continue doing this, then it's going to be good for everybody, right? And so that is part of the reason that they were able to effectively argue that they should not be covered by taxi regulations. And similarly, that Airbnb should not be covered by hotel regulations because they emerged in a similar time.
Don't bog us down with all of this unnecessary red tape. This bureaucratic nightmare is going to just throttle innovation in the cradle.
Exactly.
Does that
And then
sound
the
about
idea,
right?
yeah, and then the idea then is that if you don't do this, then we can provide this service that's going to be great for consumers, and it's going to be so much cheaper because we're not, encumbered with these regulations. Just forget the fact that we're losing billions of dollars a year in order to make our service look cheaper than it actually is.
Which leads me to my next question. I'm a heartless, ruthless venture capitalist. I'm interested in making money, right? Pure and simple. That's what I do. I've got billions of dollars, but I want to make my billions into tens of billions, my tens of billions into trillions, right? That's what I want to do. Why am I giving, and let's just use Uber as an example here, Why am I giving Uber tens of billions of dollars over the course of 14, 15 years, losing money on every transaction? Now, I'm an intelligent person. I'm going to be looking at the books. They won't be able to cook them for me. And I'm going to be able to see that I am subsidizing. Every time you take a ride on Uber, I'm losing money. There's nothing I hate more than losing money. Why am I forking over more and more and more money year after year after year on a business model that doesn't seem to be profitable? Like that's what you said. It is inherently unprofitable. How am I going to get, me, the venture capitalist, my tens of billions of dollars back just for break even? Never mind the tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars more that I want as a result of my investment in Uber.
Yeah, on its face, it makes absolutely no sense, right?
I'm confused. I'm
Yeah.
hoping you can enlighten me.
Yeah, and the idea with these venture capitalists is that they make a bet on a lot of companies, and a lot of them are gonna fail and not work out. But they're hoping that enough of them are going to become like the new kind of Facebooks and the new like massive companies that they're going to be able to make their money back on this stuff. And so part of the reason that companies like Uber and Lyft were able to lose so much money over such a long period of time, there's a number of reasons there, right? First of all, after the 2008 recession, interest rates were cut to staggeringly low amounts. And of course, as we know, they've only really started to come up significantly in the past year or so.
As they were at or near zero, and for a long time below the rate of inflation. So
exactly. Yeah. And so that means that, it's very cheap and very easy to access capital, even if you don't have a great business model to do that. Like, you're not going to have to pay back a ton of interest on all this debt that you're accruing as a result. But then the other piece of this is that we assume, or we might assume, traditionally that an investor makes their money when a company becomes profitable, right? They want the company to generate profits, and that is how, they kind of get their returns. But that is not always the case, right? When we look at these tech companies in particular, what's happening is these investors and these venture capitalists, the venture capitalists in particular, are making these bets, as I said, on a lot of different companies, and a lot of them won't work out, but they get in very early. And that means that they get a large stake at a very low cost, right? Mm-hmm. And so their goal is not so much, to make a profitable company at the end of the day, though certainly that would work out. That would be great. But ultimately their goal is to have this company kind of monopolize or kind of oligopolize a sector of the economy that it can kind of take rents out of and take a lot of money out of. But even if that doesn't work out, there's another way that they can make their money back, right? Because they bought into this company at a really early stage, and they got a big chunk of it for a smaller kind of amount of money than the company becomes worth as it grows. Because even though Uber was losing a lot of money, it was still valued in the many billions of dollars, right? So as soon as that company goes public on the stock markets, those investors can sell their stakes in the company, even though
so Uber went public, never having showed a profit. Exactly. But I, the venture capitalist, have a big chunk of it. I just sell my stake as part of the IPO. I get my money back. It doesn't matter if Uber is ever profitable or not.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. I guess. Was it the greater fool theory, right? Like, as long as there's a sucker down the road who's willing to value this money losing company in the tens of billions of dollars, I'm made whole.
Exactly. And that was one of the things that we saw a lot in the crypto boom, right? A lot of the critics of cryptocurrencies and what was happening then were saying that these investors are getting in really early. They're getting access to these coins or these NFTs at a really early stage. Then the price jumps really quickly and they can sell out right away, right? They don't need to wait for any company to go public or anything like that. They just own the tokens or the NFTs, and then they can sell them immediately. And so what we see in kind of, the stock market side of this, if we're looking at an Uber, for example, is this process takes longer than it would in the crypto boom. You have to wait many years for these companies to go public. But even then, the idea is that because the company is going public, there's going to be kind of retail investors and institutional investors who want to buy into it once it goes public. And then those investors can offload their stakes onto these other investors who are told that this company will eventually, be profitable or will eventually have a monopoly that will allow it to make a lot of money. But again, they're kind of going on faith there, but the venture capitalists can make their money by cashing out at that point. And because they bought their stake in the company at such a low valuation very early on in its existence, they can make a lot of money that way.
All right, let me give you a counterpoint to this, and that is the largest company in the world, Amazon. It also, for the first, I don't know, 15, maybe 20 years of its existence, never showed a profit. In fact, as it grew, its profits grew, and it went public. I don't recall the history of whether it was funded by venture capital or not, but it just lost money year after year after year as it grew larger and larger and larger. And then there was a point when it did become profitable on its own, and now is, I believe, by market share, sorry, not by market capitalization, the largest company in the world, and it is enormously profitable on multiple levels, from its retail operations and web services being the two largest, I believe. So now this is, I think, an example of a genuine tech company doing something that was genuinely innovative, lost many losses for years, but on the quest to being profitable. These other companies, are they following the Amazon track, or is it just what you were doing? And should we all be trying to emulate Amazon, or do you have some critiques about that company as well?
Yeah, I definitely have critiques.
All right. Well, yeah. let's compare Amazon to the cryptocurrency and the asset-light companies, and then we'll move on to focus on Amazon itself.
Totally. Because I think your question was a really good one, right? Like, why is this not working out in the Uber case when it worked out so well in the Amazon case, or at least, well for Amazon and its investors, right? Amazon, as you said, did lose a lot of money as it sought to grow. And Jeff Bezos was very open about the fact that they were going to do that, right? He said, we're not going to make profits now. We're going to invest a lot so we can grow really quickly and we can kind of capture the market, right? And their kind of e-commerce operations were kind of building on, what other companies had done in the past, companies like Walmart, right? But we're just moving this online and kind of taking advantage of supply chains.
I'm old enough to remember when Amazon was an online bookstore.
Yeah, totally. And, Amazon also had some of those aspects that we were talking about with Uber, where they were trying to avoid regulations and taxes and things like that, right? Part of the reason that Jeff Bezos established Amazon in Washington State was not because he was looking to not because he was from there, not because he loved that state, but because I believe there was no corporate income tax there. It ensured that the sales tax that he had to pay was very low locally, and then would not have to be charged in the other states around the country. And so Washington State had quite a low population, so it was useful for them. And of course, there were bookseller warehouses close to there, right? Now, of course, lawmakers have caught up and they do have to charge sales tax in other states. But for a while, that was a benefit that Amazon got.
So with no sales tax in Washington State, I sell a book at the cover price. If I'm in California, and I don't know what the sales tax is, I'm just going to say 5%, but I'm sure the actual number is different. And I'm a California bookseller, I have to charge 5%. So if I order through Amazon, it's effectively a 5% subsidy that Amazon is getting. Regulatory arbitrage again. Interesting.
Exactly. Well,
I'm detecting a pattern here.
Yeah. What would happen is they would have to charge sales tax to people in Washington State, but not in any other states, right? Because they weren't technically operating in those states. And of course, that has changed now, where they do have to charge sales tax in those other states. But if, say, you would walk into a physical bookstore in Los Angeles, you would have to pay sales tax by buying your book there. But if you went on to Amazon and bought it, you wouldn't have to pay any sales tax, right?
So I can see why that's a compelling offer right there. because it's the same book.
But if we're looking at the kind of bigger business model, as you would say, Amazon lost a lot of money, but then it was able to kind of, take advantage of its growth and get savings that came from that, right? Because it was operating a logistics company. And so there's an economy of scale that came with that. As the company got larger, it was able to take advantage of that size to reduce its overall costs of shipping out goods and acquiring goods and all of that kind of stuff, right? Of its logistics operations. And the assumption and what Uber always said was that as it grows, it will do the same thing as Amazon, right? And it will be able to reduce its costs. But that is not really true, right? If we look at the operations of taxi companies, we can see that there's very little economies of scale that comes with that, especially with the way that Uber is operating. Because as you said, it's an asset-light company. So it doesn't own a fleet of vehicles where it can have a lot of similar vehicles and it can insure them together, and it can ensure that kind of common maintenance is done on them and all these sorts of where you would actually get cost savings from that. Instead, it has all of these drivers who own their own vehicles, who handle their own insurance, who handle their own maintenance. And that means that the cost of delivering that service is higher than if it had all of those things in-house.
Right. It might be lower for Airbnb, but the total cost of delivering the service is higher. They've just offloaded the costs, or many of the costs, onto the owners of the vehicles, which is off Airbnb's books. That's separate.
Yeah, and you don't get the
sorry, not Airbnb. I mean Uber, Lyft.
Yeah, Uber, but it's similar with Airbnb as well. But you don't get the economies of scale of kind of operating these large companies then,
right?
But also because delivering a service like taxis is inherently labor intensive, right? And that's part of the reason why they used to talk about self-driving cars, kind of getting rid of the drivers. That never really happened, but was because a large percentage of the cost of delivering those services is labor and the cost of the vehicle, right? And this doesn't really go down just because you have a really large company, especially if you're not managing a fleet of vehicles. And Hubert Horan is a transportation consultant who's been writing about Uber for years. And one of the arguments that he made that I think is really compelling is that the Uber model promised to be more efficient, right? Because it was bringing in all these new technologies and whatever. But actually, the model is less efficient than what came before because it's not able to really reduce those labor costs other than cutting the wages of drivers. And that means that drivers are in a worse position. And it's not able to cut the cost of operating the vehicles other than paying drivers less to basically cover the cost of their vehicles. But on top of that, it has these really expensive, fancy headquarters that cost a lot of money to operate. It has all these really highly paid kind of technical engineers and stuff like that that are working at the company. It's losing all this money on self-driving cars and flying cars and all this stuff it was playing with for a while.
Did you say flying cars?
Yes, yeah, that was one of the things it was playing with at one point.
I know that they had they had a self-driving car division, and they had to pay another company to take it off of their hands.
Correct.
So they don't have one anymore. But I'm sorry, can you floored me here?
Yeah.
You're not exaggerating here. You're serious, or we're serious. Flying cars.
So. This is kind of how I would refer to it. What I'm actually saying is it's kind of like a modified version of a helicopter. eVTOL is the electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicle, is like the more technical term. They were promising that they were basically going to have a rideshare service for the skies. And this was going to be one of their offerings. And they also sold that off around the time of when.
Wow. I completely missed that. So thank you.
Yeah. But again, another big thing that they were losing a bunch of money on, right? And so Hubert Horan, this transportation consultant who's, had decades of experience, he essentially looked at this and he said, the model of delivering taxis is actually more efficient than the Uber model because you have these individual taxi companies. They're just kind of managing their local costs, their local vehicles. They don't have these really expensive headquarters around the world. They don't have these CEOs that are being paid, many millions of dollars a year. They don't have these engineers being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to develop these technologies. If we look at what has happened over the past decade or so, as the Uber model has become more common, is a lot of traditional taxi companies have actually implemented kind of app-based ways to hail rides and to kind of see where your driver is in real time. So I think that was a useful development from the rollout of Uber. But unfortunately, you also had kind of the decimation of taxi regulations, the erosion in the kind of worker or the kind of livelihoods of taxi drivers and Uber drivers. You had all these real negative externalities that came of that. And now what we have is, Ubers are more difficult to get than they used to be. They're more expensive than they used to be because the company finally has to turn a profit because interest rates are going up. And all of the big promises that they made about improving transportation in cities never really came to pass.
Right. So, but the story they described sounded great and compelling and wonderful, but it was never. It hasn't turned out to be a reality, and looks like it never will be.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, so then let's move on to Amazon, because that's where essentially the promises made early on in the company did come to pass, and it is a profitable company, and it was innovative, and it has had like more than one major insight or major innovation that has come to benefit the company, and yet you're still not singing Amazon's praises. So obviously we've got to move into new territory. What's wrong with Amazon, and how it came to power, or not to power, so how it came to being profitable and wealthy and the largest company in the world, and how it's operating today?
Yeah, again, like so many things. But I would point to this specifically, and I can certainly expand on other parts of the Amazon business or aspects of the business model too, right? But if you look at Amazon and how it has been able to grow so significantly, I would say that it has similar kind of qualities of these other tech companies that we've been talking about, right? Where their real innovations are not inherently technological, though they do kind of use new technologies in order to manage the kind of fulfillment and the logistics in their warehouses and their delivery network. Absolutely, they have developed new tools to do that, right? But I would argue that the real cost savings that they experience comes from, again, changing the way that labor works in the delivery of their services.
Okay,
And so if you look at an Amazon warehouse, right, if you think about warehousing itself and logistics, these are traditionally unionized professions, right, where people do make pretty good livings if they stick at that and make that their career, whether it's working in warehouses, whether it's doing deliveries, UPS, Canada Post, of course, are unionized. Many of these delivery companies are as well. And, UPS drivers, notably make pretty good wages because they are unionized with the Teamsters and they have a really good contract and stuff. So Amazon, I would argue its real innovation is that it has fought to keep unions out of its warehouses and its delivery network. And as a result, it has been able to push down wages significantly and also to roll out technologies within its warehouses that surveil the workers constantly, that increase the speed of work, so the pressure to produce more. And so that really benefits Amazon as a company, but that means that the workers are paid less, have a lower standard of living, but also have a greater risk of injury, both in the United States and Canada, as reporting by the Reveal Center for Investigative Work in the United States has shown, and as reporting by the Toronto Star has shown in Canada. And so that has a real effect on those workers, because they are not making as much money as they would have traditionally made in a unionized environment. And Amazon hires a lot of well-paid anti-union consultants to ensure that those warehouses do not unionize and to try to kind of break any efforts to unionize, as we have seen in the United States. But also in its delivery network, it traditionally relied on UPS and Canada Post and these various services, and it still does to a significant degree, but people will have seen the Amazon Prime trucks, in their city out delivering things if they live in a larger city in the US or Canada. And that is to build out its own delivery network that is non-union, that again is paid less money, that is again surveilled in the way that their warehouse workers are. And in this case, Amazon doesn't hire those delivery drivers directly itself. It uses third-party companies that hire the drivers, then Amazon sets the conditions of their work. And what we've seen in the United States is that when those delivery service partners, as they're called, the drivers who work for these third-party companies try to unionize, Amazon cuts their contract and will get a different company to start doing the delivery services. So again, pushing down wages, ensuring they can't be unionized, and ensuring that the standard of work and of life for these workers is much lower than, if there was another company kind of handling it.
All right. So I don't know the answer to this, but I'm curious. Let's imagine that Amazon behaved differently and that it gave its workers a decent wage, however you wish to define that, a livable wage, a generous wage. I know that it's enormously profitable. How much less profitable would it be if it didn't engage in these practices that you've just described?
Yeah, I certainly couldn't quantify that for you. I haven't kind of run the numbers on that, but
Okay.
I think you could clearly see that it wouldn't be as profitable as it is, if it is at all, but it would also have kind of less control over workers, because when the workers are unionized, they have more say over how technology is rolled out in the workplace, because they have to negotiate a contract with the employer, and their union does. And so they have some degree of collective power to push back on, what management can expect of them. And we know that in Amazon warehouses, one of the things that workers complain about, complain is probably the wrong word there, but, realistically kind of say is a problem in their workplaces, is the constant surveillance, the pressure that they're under, the fact that they can't even go to the washroom because then they'll get dinged, like they'll kind of get a mark on their record because they've taken too much time away from scanning things and picking up parcels and packaging and whatnot, right? And I think everyone could recognize that that is not the kind of working conditions that we want to be kind of foundational to how, life in our society works, I guess, right? Especially for this infrastructure that has just become incredibly essential, right? And so we have these workers that are making less money than they would have traditionally made in these industries, and that is of course pushing down the standards in the industry, in the industry beyond Amazon. And then on the other side of it, you have a man like Jeff Bezos, who I believe is the second richest man in the world right now, and kind of uses his vast wealth to funnel it into like space travel and space exploration. People might remember when he did his little blast off a year or two ago, to go up into the sky in one of his rockets. When he came back down, he said, "I want to thank all the Amazon workers and customers because you paid for this." And, it was basically an admission that, you're not being paid so well, but, you allowed me to spend all my money on my rocket company. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's an eternal tension between corporate interests and worker and labor interests, and I think I think that tension is healthy, but it becomes unhealthy when one side or the other has, where there basically isn't a tension, and that one side or the other can just dictate the terms. And what you're describing is in Amazon, it's the corporate interests that are simply dictating the terms, and labor has no say, and that's the concentration of power is
Exactly.
I think is the problem, or is a problem.
Yeah, look, I think that's so spot on, right? Because just going back to something that you said earlier in the conversation, kind of when you were introducing it, I think it's important to recognize always that technologies have provided a lot of kind of important developments in human life, right? Like we need to recognize that, medical advancements and just, the part of the reason that we can live so long today is because of, improvements in hygiene and all these other things that have been made possible through innovations and developments that have happened over time. But I think that my concern is that a lot of the technologies that we just see deployed right now, and a lot of what we consider technology, is often digital technologies, right? Connected to the internet or related to computers, right? And of course, there's been lots of benefits to the internet and stuff like that as well. But I would argue that a lot of the kind of effort that we see in the tech industry today, meaning these kind of Silicon Valley companies and companies that are inspired by them, is to use kind of our traditional associations with technology and the association between technology and progress, to have us kind of be more open to adopting, whatever it is that they want to foist on us, and to believe their marketing and their PR that everything they release is going to be great and good for us, when actually, when we look at the real impact of their technologies, it is to increase the power of the people who are in control of those technologies and to decrease the power of everyone else. So we very often see these technologies rolled out in such a way that the public and that workers are increasingly disempowered, so that the people in control of this industry and these large companies actually kind of accrue greater wealth and greater power as a result. And I think that, because of all the excitement around tech and the internet and stuff like that in the 90s and in the 2010s after the recession, that we were a bit late in recognizing that and in starting to push back on it. And now we have these growing efforts to regulate the tech industry and to try to rein in these incredibly powerful companies and people. But because we let them accrue so much power and wealth for so long, that has meant that it is much more difficult to do that than if we had recognized what was actually happening earlier than we did.
Right, and actually, that's an excellent segue to the last categorization that I have, and I know I'm leaving out a few companies, but I'm an amateur and I'm doing my best here. And everything that we've talked about so far is kind of a hybrid between the physical world and the digital world. So when we're talking about Airbnb or Uber, even Amazon is still fundamentally about moving things from place A to place B, organized and aided by some digital innovations. But we do have like pure digital companies, and what I'm thinking about here are when are the tech company giants, the real big ones, and I'm thinking about companies like Google and its numerous subsidiaries, and Facebook slash Instagram and its associated properties, to a lesser extent Twitter, now rebranded X, and these are things that like basically didn't exist before. And from my perspective, I'm just a guy. I get to go on to Google and I get free email. And like I get multiple gigs. I can like years and years of sending attachments and pictures and videos, and it's free. And I was on a trip and I used Google Maps on nearly a daily basis to get me from place A to place B. Enormously useful, very valuable. It means I didn't have to buy maps and look it out and figure out where I am and how to get there. It was all right there. With Facebook, I was in high school decades ago, and I can keep in touch with friends and current ones. And again, completely free. So these are pretty clearly digital innovations, or they're innovative. They're something that they're not replicating something that existed before, but perhaps a little bit better or a little bit cheaper. This is all cost-free, tremendously valuable services in terms of the value that's providing to me, and even on Twitter, being able to get the thoughts of whoever it is that I'm interested in, whether they're celebrities or scientists or journalists or politicians or other friends. Like I get to follow their thoughts and insights, and gives me food for thought, and it's enormously stimulating. So, what could possibly be bad?
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it, because I think these companies and these services did offer us a lot of benefits, right? Especially in years past when they were more nascent and it was still easier for them to
Google
grow.
in their IPO documents said that their motto was "Don't be evil." This is great. I love this.
They did drop that a few years ago, though. Officially,
they did. It's true.
They decided being evil was a bit more profitable, I think. But like if you think about Google, it kind of kind of put the web in one place and made it easy for us to search it and find what we were looking for online, right? Facebook connected us with our friends and with people that we might have lost touch with, and made it easy to figure out what was going on in those people's lives, in the world. Like, there were very clear benefits that a lot of these companies offered us, and the downside seemed very small, right? Okay, we need to look at some ads sometimes. They're going to collect some data on us, but that is a reasonable trade-off for what we're getting from, going into this ecosystem, from using these services. I think that one of the
You've
things...
made my point beautifully.
Exactly.
That's exactly right.
And that's why billions of us made that trade, right? Because it made perfect sense to do it. We didn't really think about the potential consequences of data collection in the way that we're beginning to think about them now. But I think that the bigger, point here is, we can look back and see the positives that came of that, and see how we use these services, though, because we all went into those services, we made those companies immensely profitable and immensely powerful as well. Because now, because they are in these central positions, because, so many people use Facebook, because so many people use Google, now when they make changes, that has massive impacts, and we're all used to kind of using these centralized platforms to do things, and that means it significantly affects, how would you put it? Everything that we do online, the kind of information that we access, the kind of interactions that we have. For example, just an easy example is the fact that Facebook has already pulled news on its platform in Canada, and Google is threatening to do the same. And so these platforms that we put our faith in are now saying, oh, this doesn't work for our business model and our bottom line, so we're just going to kind of completely change how you use this platform now. But again, I want to make a bigger point here, and that's that this trade-off made sense, right? This trade-off, worked for a lot of us, and it was partially because these services worked really well. When you used Google, you almost always kind of got what you were looking for, right? You got really good answers to
Yeah, there
problems.
were a lot of other search engines at the time, and
Exactly.
Google's simply was the best of the ones that were available at the time.
And many would say that's still the case, right? Even though there's Bing and other things like that, Google is still kind of the high watermark for these other services to meet. And Facebook as well. Certainly Facebook had its issues, but for the most part, using that service was enjoyable, right? And it gave you things that you wanted from it. But I would say that what we've seen over the past couple of years in particular is that the growth in these companies has sort of plateaued, and the prospect for easy future revenue growth has plateaued. And so that means that now they need to find other ways to kind of wring more profit and growth out of us to keep their investors happy, because these are public companies. And that means that the quality of the service is now being eroded, while kind of the costs to the user are increasing, right? And that doesn't mean that they're necessarily adding a fee for use of the service, but now maybe the data collection is more intrusive, or now maybe there are more ads than there used to be. And at the same time, the service isn't, Facebook isn't showing you news. And many people, I think, would recognize that Google, the search engine, is not delivering the same quality of results as it used to in the past, right? If you search for certain things now, you're just going to see a bunch of kind of useless articles from random websites that are just trying to get your clicks and get you to look at ads on their websites, and not actually providing you with the answers that you would have gotten in the past, right? And so the promise that these companies made to us is really breaking down. And I think that there are many reasons for that. I think the key one is because easy growth is over, and they need to find new ways to kind of keep, kind of the money train going. But that is going to significantly affect how we use the web in the years to come, I think.
Yeah, and let me just, from personal experience, echo what you've said. I have almost stopped using Facebook recently, and I thought about why, and I realized, and I counted that while scrolling through my feed, only about 1/3, it was just over 1/3 of the posts that I saw were from friends and people I follow. And so, well over half, nearly 2/3 of my feed were various advertisements or promoted posts, and what they thought, what Facebook thought my interests were. And I was like, where are the people that I want to follow? And there was so much clutter that I can't say that I'm never on it anymore, but it has drastically reduced the amount of time I spend on Facebook. And I have also noted the decline in Google accuracy. And I don't know whether I should blame Google for that or the plethora of, I guess, effective search engine optimization companies. But either way, it's not as good as it used to be. Look, Paris, we've been talking for about an hour. I gave what I hoped was a reasonable overview or classification of the tech industry, but I'm not an expert and you are. So what have I left out, and what else should I and the listeners of Podcast for Inquiry consider when thinking about the tech industry?
No, I think it was a great interview, and we covered so many, different aspects of the industry. One of the things about the tech industry is that it really is increasingly everything, right? When we used to think about the tech industry, it was the stuff that happened online and these internet companies. But as you said, and as we've discussed, they are increasingly moving out into the world, and basically anything that has some kind of like app or digital interface, it can now be considered a tech company, right? And that has really serious effects for how we think about these things and kind of potential impacts that these companies can have on
and
the world.
It's so popular. Like I remember there was a company called WeWork, and they branded themselves as a tech company. And I was like, okay. And I looked at it. It's like, you're a hip, stylish corporate real estate company. Like, where's the tech element to it? And I never saw it. And again, I'm not an expert, but it seemed to me like they were a reasonably good corporate real estate company, and they had some very good designers, and their workplaces looked fascinating. So I think they were a good company, but I didn't see the real tech element to it. But because they called themselves a tech company, their valuations or their expected valuations were sky high, and I couldn't figure that out. It's like, you've got a good business here. Why are you shooting for the stars when you can have you're shooting for, you're going to get none of a lot instead of having all of a bit of it, and it kind of collapsed. Was it in any way a tech company, or was it a corporate real estate design firm that sort of was overambitious and therefore imploded?
Yeah, it was a shared office company that saw the use of a tech branding, basically.
Okay.
Right?
It's because it's popular. If you call yourself a tech company, your valuations go up. I remember reading, this was a few years ago when cryptocurrencies were in vogue. A company just put Bitcoin in its name, or blockchain in its name. It didn't change anything, just changed its name, and it tripled in value the next day. There was no change in their business. They weren't actually using blockchain any more than they were the day before, but by putting it in their name, whoop. So I guess there's a lot of irrationality in the markets, despite what we may think about bloodless capitalists disciplining companies, or it's just as subject to fads, or at least is certainly subject to fads as any other industry.
Absolutely. Well, what you see now is they're all kind of talking about their new AI.
Oh my gosh! Yes.
AI, right? And I think that's probably a good kind of final point for me to make, right? It's just, to consider the various companies that we've been talking about and the various kind of iterations of tech and the future that the tech industry has presented to us. And one thing that I thought, Malcolm Harris wrote this book that came out earlier this year, I believe, called Palo Alto, which is kind of a history of California and the tech industry and stuff like that. And one of the points that he makes really well is that what the tech industry learned from the dot-com crash, around 1999, 2000, after that first big kind of wave of investment into the internet after it was privatized in 1995, was not that they shouldn't keep creating bubbles and having them crash, but rather that they should keep doing that time and again and just try to make sure that they cash out at the top.
Try to time it.
Exactly. And so that's why constantly there is always a new tech product or a new kind of tech sector that we need to get all excited about, that's going to change everything, that's going to be the future of whatever. And so then it gets all exploded. There's all this money that rushes into these companies. Then inevitably within a year or two, that crashes, it goes away, it doesn't fulfill its promises.
Which we saw with NFTs just a couple of years ago.
Exactly.
And now it's AI.
Exactly. And then some investors cash out and make their money. And then they just all kind of keep going to the next thing. So now we have AI. People are already kind of suggesting that the steam is slowly starting to come out of that bubble. And then what's going to come next? Who knows? But I guarantee you there will be something next that's going to transform the world and be our next big savior, and then it won't actually deliver on any of those promises.
Well, we have your podcast, Tech Won't Save Us, to keep us informed, and I learned a lot listening to it. I'll put a link to that and your website, Paris, in today's show notes, and people that are interested can learn more from there. So, Paris Marx, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation on Podcast for Inquiry.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. Email us at podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centerforinquiry.ca/donate or becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. Your contribution supports our efforts to have rational and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centerforinquiry.ca. We are on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Lee Shields, Zach Dumont, and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.